And I mean, looking at the fact that the EFF's core key issue is to nationalize mines in order to bridge inequalities in South Africa, do you think this is the correct model to use in our country?
Well, it it really depends on what your priorities are. So, for instance, if you are a Mbeki policymaker around, let's say you work for Treasury, you work for public enterprises and all of that, what you'll be thinking in those portfolios under Mbeki government, which had quite a cozy relationship with neoliberal policies, is that nationalizing would be detrimental. In fact, it is about privatizing. But from the perspective of the EFF, which the target, it seems, is to drive sort of state provision, is to drive welfarist nature of the state, is to drive perhaps a more socialist kind of government. They'll argue social democratic. But so if that is your objective, then nationalization could work for you. Whether it's practical or not, well, there are not so many practical examples. I mean, individuals point to Venezuela. Venezuela has had this nationalization of oil resources or key industries within the country, and what we've seen was rocketing inflation. What we've seen was basically the state being inundated because it does not have the capacity to be the be-all of the economy and be-all of public service provision. So they'll need to think around that. But in terms of nationalization, well, it would flout whatever constitutional framework you would have in order for you to implement that. You would sort of need to set aside some provisions set by the Constitution around the compensation, around land, around security of tenure, those sort of things. Whether it's feasible or not, well, perhaps the EFF would be something that will break away from the mold, but looking at other countries that have embarked on the entirety of nationalization, those countries struggle to create growth, those countries struggle to create local demand, they struggle to create consumer demand. So from looking at that, given that much of the world is a sort of market-driven economy, it really is difficult to see how EFF would align around that framework.
And I mean, Malema also mentioned that the EFF is planning to do away with the tender system. Having gained from it himself, do you think it's credible to say something like that?
Well, what we learn from politicians is that positions change. So let's just assume that his position has changed. And, one would sort of understand why they would prioritize that, because they feel that the proliferation of corruption, the continued occurrence of corruption, has been mainly through this tender system. And they emphasize that you ought to capacitate the state in order to carry out, for instance, you look at a newspaper, they will sometimes put out a tender for someone to go buy stationery for them. And that, of course, is not a function that requires some specialist skills at all. And, of course, we know that these are procured at really exorbitant prices. So there is some merit to that. But perhaps rather than doing that, there are instances where the state will be found wanting. For instance, if you look at the defense industry, of course we have denial, but you'll find that some of the procurement, even if the state were to invest heavy resources in capacitating itself, it would be unable to do so. And it's actually cheaper to procure services from a person who does this as a specialist thing.